In the quiet shadows of history, there are moments when the world holds its breath, waiting for a soul destined to reshape the very fabric of civilization. The year 742 Anno Domini was such a moment, though few could have known it then. Europe lay fragmented, a shattered mirror reflecting the lost glory of Rome, each piece a kingdom unto itself, suspicious and warring. Knowing nothing of the unity that once was, into this fractured world, somewhere in the Frankish heartlands, perhaps in the royal estate of Herstal, perhaps elsewhere, for history keeps some secrets close, a child was born. They would call him Charles, Karl in his own Germanic tongue, a name that would echo through the centuries, growing in weight and majesty until it became legend itself. Charlemagne, Charles the Great. The world he entered bore little resemblance to the ordered empire that had fallen 3 centuries before. Where Roman roads once carried commerce and legions, now bandits lurked. Where Latin culture had flourished, now a patchwork of tribal customs held sway. The great cities had shrunk to mere shadows, their amphitheaters crumbling, their aqueducts broken. Learning had retreated into monastery walls, preserved by monks who copied ancient texts by candlelight, knowing that outside, darkness pressed close. The Frankish kingdom itself was a rough and violent place, built not on the elegance of Roman law, but on the strength of warrior bonds and the loyalty of arms. Kings ruled because they could fight, and they kept their crowns only as long as their sword arms remained strong. It was a world where power spoke in the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves, where Christian faith and pagan custom mixed like oil and water, never quite settling into peace. Yet within this chaos something was stirring. The Frankish kingdom, among all the Germanic peoples who had carved up the Roman West, showed a peculiar vitality. They had embraced Christianity fully, not the Arian heresy of the Goths and Vandals, but the orthodox faith of Rome itself. This gave them a legitimacy, a connection to the old empire that other kingdoms lacked. They were, in some strange way, the inheritors of Rome's spiritual authority, even as they remained warriors in leather and iron. Charles was born into the Carolingian dynasty, though that name would come later, derived from his own. His grandfather, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, had earned eternal fame by stopping the Muslim advance at Tours in 732, a mere decade before this birth. That victory had reverberated across Christian Europe like a bell in the night, a signal that someone, somewhere, still had the strength to stand against the tide. The child born in 742 entered a world balanced on a knife's edge between collapse and renewal. The old was dying, but the new had not yet been born. It would take a man of extraordinary vision, ruthless determination, and boundless energy to forge something lasting from these broken pieces. It would take someone willing to wade through rivers of blood to reach a dream of unity. History, in its mysterious way, had provided such a man. He simply didn't know it yet. He was an infant, crying in the cold spring air, unaware that his life would become the hinge upon which Europe's fate would turn. The blood that flowed through young Charles's veins carried the weight of revolution and ambition, of calculated risk and ruthless pragmatism. His father, Pepin, known to history as Pepin the Short for his diminutive stature, though none dared mock him to his face, had accomplished what few men could even imagine. He had overthrown a dynasty and taken a crown that was not his by birth. The Merovingians, the long-haired kings who had ruled the Franks for nearly 3 centuries, had, by Pepin's time, become little more than ceremonial figureheads, puppets moved by the true power behind the throne, the mayors of the palace. These mayors, chief ministers in name but kings in all but title, had accumulated real power, while the Merovingian kings degenerated into weak, ineffectual shadows, trotted out for ceremonies and then returned to their estates. Pepin's own father, Charles Martel, had been content to rule as mayor, to wield power without wearing the crown. But Pepin possessed a bolder vision. In 751, in an act of breathtaking audacity, he sent envoys to Pope Zacharias in Rome with a question that would change everything. Who should be king? He who holds the title but has no power, or he who holds the power but lacks the title? The Pope's answer was everything Pepin needed. With papal blessing, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was shorn of his sacred long hair, the symbol of his dynasty's mystical right to rule, and sent to a monastery. Pepin was anointed king in a ceremony that borrowed heavily from Old Testament traditions, the holy oil marking him as God's chosen ruler. It was a revolution wrapped in religious legitimacy, a coup sanctified by the highest authority in Christendom. This was the legacy into which Charles was born, ambition married to pragmatism, power legitimized by faith, and the understanding that the world could be reshaped by those bold enough to seize it. His father had proven that destiny was not fixed, that even the oldest dynasties could fall, that new orders could be built on the ruins of the old. Young Charles grew up in a household of constant motion. The Frankish court was not a fixed palace but a travelling enterprise, moving from royal estate to royal estate, consuming local resources before moving on. He would have learned early that a king must be visible, must be present among his people, must lead from the front rather than hide behind walls. He would have absorbed the warrior culture that permeated everything, the weapons practice, the hunting, the constant talk of campaigns and battles, and the loyalty of retainers. His mother, Bertrada of Laon, played a role whose full extent history has partially obscured, but we know she was no passive figure. After Pepin's death, she would prove herself a skilled diplomat, negotiating marriages and alliances with a sure hand. From her, perhaps, Charles learned that power had many forms, that sometimes a carefully arranged marriage could achieve what armies could not. The family's alliance with the papacy, forged by his father's coup, would prove central to everything that followed. The popes needed protection from the Lombards who threatened Rome from the north. The Carolingians needed the spiritual legitimacy that only the successor of St. Peter could provide. It was a partnership built on mutual need, and young Charles grew up understanding that spiritual and temporal power, when aligned, could move mountains. This was the heritage that shaped him: revolutionary blood, papal blessing, warrior culture, and the understanding that the world was malleable to those with vision and will enough to reshape it. There is something deeply formative about growing up in the shadow of warfare, about coming of age in a world where the clang of sword on shield is as common as birdsong, where a boy learns to ride before he learns to read, where strength and courage are not abstract virtues but daily requirements for survival. Charles's education was the education of a Frankish warrior prince, practical and brutal and utterly focused on the arts of war and rule. Literacy, while valued by the church, was not essential for a king in the mid-8th century. What mattered was the ability to lead men in battle, to judge disputes with swift fairness, to inspire loyalty, and to project an aura of invincible strength. These were the lessons young Charles absorbed with every sunrise. The boy would have begun his martial training early, perhaps as young as 5 or 6, learning first to ride the sturdy Frankish horses that were smaller than modern breeds but hardy and reliable. The saddle would have been his second home, riding skills as natural as breathing, for a Frankish nobleman who could not ride was no nobleman at all. He learned to control a horse with his knees, leaving his hands free for weapons, to move as one with the animal in the chaos of battle. As he grew, the weapons came. First wooden swords teaching the basic cuts and parries. Then, as his strength developed, real steel, though blunted for practice. The Frankish sword was not the elegant rapier of later centuries. but a heavy, brutal weapon designed for cleaving through shields and mail. It took tremendous strength to wield effectively in battle, hour after hour, and that strength could only be built through years of constant practice. He learned the spear, the primary weapon of Frankish warfare, easier to make and use than swords, deadly in skilled hands. He learned the bow, though archery was less emphasized among the Franks than among some other peoples. He learned to fight on foot and mounted, to command in formation and to duel one-on-one. Every skill was honed not for sport, but for the real possibility, the near certainty that he would soon need it in actual combat. But warfare was not merely a matter of personal prowess. A king needed to understand strategy, logistics, the movement of armies across difficult terrain. Charles would have accompanied his father on campaigns, watching how Pepin organized supply lines, chose ground for battle, negotiated with recalcitrant nobles, and dealt with the endless complications of leading a medieval army. These lessons, absorbed through observation and participation, would prove more valuable than any formal schooling. He learned, too, the political arts, how to judge men's characters, how to reward loyalty and punish betrayal, how to navigate the complex web of obligations and alliances that held the Frankish kingdom together. He sat in his father's court when disputes were judged, watched how power was balanced and maintained, observed the careful dance of majesty and accessibility that made a king beloved rather than merely feared. In 768, when Charles was in his mid-20s, his education reached its inevitable conclusion. Pepin the Short, the king who had overthrown a dynasty and forged a new alliance with Rome, fell ill. He had given his son the tools to rule, the martial prowess, the strategic mind, the understanding of power's mechanisms. Now, as death approached, he would give him the kingdom itself. Yet Pepin made a decision that would complicate everything. He divided the realm between his two sons, Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne. It was the Frankish custom, this division of inheritance, meant to be fair, but so often leading to conflict and civil war. The stage was set not just for Charles's rise, but for a test that would prove whether he had truly learned his father's lessons. There is something profoundly unnatural about dividing power between brothers, about taking a unified realm and cleaving it in two, expecting harmony to emerge from artificial separation. Yet this was the Frankish way, the ancient custom of partible inheritance, and when Pepin died in September of 768, his kingdom was split down the middle like a carcass at a butcher's block. Charles received the outer territories, a crescent of lands wrapping around his brothers, holdings stretching from the Atlantic coast, through Neustria and into Austrasia, then south into Aquitaine and the Spanish borderlands. These were frontier regions, often rebellious, requiring constant military attention. Charlemagne, the younger brother, received the heartland Burgundy, Provence, Alsace and Alemannia, richer, more settled, easier to govern. The division seemed deliberately designed to test Charles, to force him to prove himself worthy of his inheritance through constant struggle. From the beginning, tension crackled between the brothers like summer lightning before a storm. They were different men, shaped by the same heritage, yet walking divergent paths. Charles was already displaying the energy that would define his reign, restless, ambitious, always in motion. Charlemagne appears in the historical record as more cautious, perhaps more content with what he had, less driven by the demon of perpetual conquest. Their first crisis came quickly. Aquitaine, that troublesome southern territory, erupted in rebellion under a local lord named Hunald, who had once been forced to abdicate and retire to a monastery, but now saw opportunity in the confusion of succession. Charles moved swiftly to crush the uprising, his armies marching south with the efficiency that would become his trademark. He sent word to Charlemagne, requesting assistance as brothers and co-kings should provide. Charlemagne refused. The refusal spoke volumes. Whether from caution, jealousy, or calculated undermining, Charlemagne's decision not to support his brother revealed the fundamental instability of their arrangement. Charles crushed the rebellion anyway, pursuing Hunald all the way into Gascony, forcing the rebel to seek refuge with the Duke of Gascony, who wisely surrendered the troublemaker rather than face Charles's wrath. The message was clear. Charles did not need his brother's help to impose his will. The years that followed, from 768 to 771, were years of cold coexistence, of two courts that should have been one, of duplicated efforts and wasted energy. Their mother, Bertrada, attempted to mediate, arranging diplomatic marriages and alliances meant to bind the brothers together. She negotiated a marriage between Charles and the daughter of Desiderius, king of the Lombards, hoping the alliance would create common cause. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Two kings in one kingdom, two wills contending for supremacy, two futures that could not both unfold. The historical sources hint at deeper animosities, at slights and insults exchanged, at the steady accumulation of grievances that poison relationships beyond repair. Court nobles began choosing sides, calculating which brother's star would rise higher. The Frankish realm, so recently unified under Pepin's strong hand, threatened to fracture permanently into rival kingdoms, perhaps eventually to face each other across blood-soaked battlefields, as so many divided inheritances had before. Yet beneath this tension, Charles was learning invaluable lessons about power and its maintenance. He was learning to rule without support, to cultivate his own network of loyal nobles, to project strength even when diplomatically isolated. He was learning that power shared is power diluted, that unity of command is worth more than fairness of division. He was learning, though he might not yet have articulated it fully, that the Frankish kingdom needed one king, one vision, one will. And then in December of 771, history intervened with the suddenness that sometimes characterizes its most decisive moments. Charlemagne, still a young man, probably not yet 30 years old, fell ill. The sickness progressed rapidly, allowing no time for preparation or arrangement of succession. Within days he was dead. The news reached Charles like a thunderbolt. His brother, his rival, the obstacle to unified rule, was gone. History does not record Charles's private thoughts in that moment, whether he felt grief, relief, or that complicated mixture of emotions that accompanies the death of a difficult family member. What we know is what he did next, and those actions would define everything that followed. There are moments in history when everything pivots on a single decision, when the path taken determines not just one man's fate, but the destiny of nations. The death of Charlemagne in December 771 was such a moment, and Charles's response revealed the character that would build an empire. By custom and by law, Charlemagne's young sons had a claim to their father's portion of the kingdom. The Frankish nobles of those territories could have rallied around these children, could have appointed regents, could have preserved the division that Pepin had created. It would have been the cautious path, the path that respected tradition and the rights of inheritance. It would also have been the path to continued weakness and eventual civil war. Charles chose otherwise. He moved with the speed that would characterize all his great decisions, acting before opposition could coalesce, before doubts could take root. Within weeks he had crossed into Charlemagne's territories, and the nobles there, faced with a fait accompli, confronted by Charles's overwhelming presence and military might, chose pragmatism over principle. They swore allegiance to the living king rather than to distant children who could offer them nothing but uncertainty. Charlemagne's widow, Gerberga, understood immediately what this meant for her and her sons. She did not wait to test Charles's mercy or to see whether some shred of family feeling might preserve her children's inheritance. She fled, taking her young sons with her, seeking protection at the court of Desiderius, the Lombard king in northern Italy. It was a desperate move, one that would have consequences neither she nor anyone else could fully foresee. But for Charles, at the age of 29, the great gamble had succeeded. He stood as sole king of all the Frankish territories, ruler of a realm that stretched from the Atlantic to Bavaria, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean borderlands. It was the largest and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and it was his, unified under his command, ready to be shaped according to his vision. The first thing he did was to make clear that this unity would not be surrendered. He gathered his nobles at his court, accepted their oaths of fealty, distributed rewards to those who had supported him, and made careful note of those who had hesitated. He began the careful work of binding the kingdom together through personal relationships, through the strategic placement of loyal men in key positions, through the assertion of royal authority in regions that had grown too accustomed to local autonomy. Yet Charles was astute enough to understand that power alone was not sufficient. His father had taught him the value of legitimacy, of having not just the strength to rule, but the right to rule. The alliance with the papacy, forged by Pepin and sanctified by holy oil, remained central to the Carolingian claim to kingship. Charles took care to present himself not as a usurper who had seized his brother's lands, but as the rightful king reunifying what should never have been divided. He also understood that a king proved himself not in peacetime comfort, but in war, in the endless struggle to expand and defend the realm. The Frankish nobility expected their king to lead them to victory and plunder, to provide opportunities for glory and wealth. A king who sat idle in his palace, no matter how legitimate his claim, would soon find his support evaporating like morning mist. And so Charles began to plan. His gaze turned to the frontiers, to the challenges that awaited on every border. To the north and east, the pagan Saxons raided and resisted, refusing to submit to either Frankish rule or Christian faith. To the south, the Lombards in Italy grew increasingly aggressive, threatening the Pope and testing the limits of Frankish protection. To the southwest, Muslim Spain represented both threat and opportunity, a wealthy civilization against which Christian warriors might test themselves. But there was another matter that demanded immediate attention, a personal matter that nonetheless carried political weight. Charles had married Desiderius's daughter at his mother's urging, part of that now abandoned attempt to create harmony with Charlemagne through Lombard alliance. But Charles no longer needed that alliance. Indeed, with Charlemagne's widow and sons now sheltering in Desiderius's court, the Lombard connection had become a liability rather than an asset. In a move that shocked contemporary observers and violated every norm of Christian marriage, Charles repudiated his Lombard wife, simply sent her back to her father without explanation or apology. It was an insult of the highest order, a diplomatic slap that humiliated Desiderius before all of Europe. More than that, it was a declaration. Charles would not be constrained by old arrangements made for old purposes. He was sole king now, and he would make his own decisions, forge his own alliances, pursue his own destiny. He married again almost immediately, taking a young Alemannian noblewoman named Hildegard as his queen. She would bear him many children and prove a worthy partner in the great work ahead. But more importantly, the marriage signaled that Charles intended to rule as he saw fit, answerable to no one's expectations but his own. The Frankish kingdom had its king. Now that king would show the world what unity of purpose and will could accomplish. Beyond the northeastern frontiers of the Frankish kingdom, in the dark forests and marshlands of what would one day be northern Germany, lived a people who had never bowed to Rome, who had never accepted the yoke of civilization, who worshipped ancient gods in sacred groves and knew nothing of Christian mercy. They were the Saxons, and they would become Charles's obsession, his endless war, the 30-year struggle that would define his reign and test the limits of his ambition. The conflict began as so many wars do, with a provocation almost too minor to mention. In 772, Saxon raiders struck into Frankish territory, burning, pillaging, and, most infuriating of all, destroying a Christian church. It was the sort of border incident that had occurred countless times before, the kind of thing that previous kings had responded to with a punitive expedition. A quick campaign to teach the raiders a lesson before winter came and everyone went home. But Charles was not a man of limited vision or modest ambitions. When he gathered his army and marched into Saxon territory that summer, he carried with him something more than the usual desire for revenge and plunder. He carried a dream of permanent conquest, of bringing these pagan lands under Christian rule, of extending Frankish dominion to the very ends of the Germanic world. His first target was the Irminsul, a sacred pillar or tree shrine that the Saxons venerated as a symbol of their god's power, perhaps representing the cosmic tree that held up the sky in their mythology. Charles did not simply defeat the local warriors who defended it. He destroyed the shrine utterly, hacked it down or burned it, sent the clear message that Saxon gods were powerless before the Christian god and Frankish steel. The destruction of the Irminsul was calculated sacrilege, a psychological blow meant to shatter Saxon confidence in their ancient ways. Charles seized the treasure that had accumulated at the shrine over generations, gold and silver offerings, and distributed it among his warriors. Then he pushed deeper into Saxon territory, imposing oaths of submission on the local chieftains, demanding tribute, and beginning the process of establishing Frankish strongholds in this hostile land. It should have been the end of it, a successful campaign that brought the Saxons to heel. Charles returned to his kingdom satisfied that he had made his point, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the people he faced. The Saxons were not a unified kingdom with a capital that could be captured and a king who could surrender for all. They were a loose confederation of tribes, fiercely independent, bound by custom and kinship rather than centralized authority. More importantly, they valued freedom above all else, the freedom to live as their ancestors had lived, to worship as they chose, to be governed by their own laws and traditions. What Charles saw as bringing civilization and salvation, they saw as enslavement and the destruction of everything that made life worth living. And so, as soon as Charles's army departed, the Saxons rose again. The pattern would repeat itself year after year with soul-crushing regularity. Charles would march into Saxon territory with overwhelming force. The Saxons would submit, swear oaths, give hostages, accept baptism. Charles would establish garrisons, build fortifications, appoint administrators, and declare the territory pacified. Then he would leave to deal with other pressing matters, for he had an entire kingdom to rule and multiple frontiers to defend, and the Saxons would rise in rebellion, massacre the garrisons, burn the churches, and return to their old ways as if nothing had changed. Each rebellion required another campaign, another summer spent in the forests and marshes, hunting an enemy who refused to fight pitched battles, who melted away before superior force only to reappear behind the Frankish lines, who made the land itself an ally with their knowledge of hidden paths and secret strongholds. It was guerrilla warfare of the most frustrating kind, war without glory, without decisive victories, without end. Charles began to realize that he had stumbled into a different kind of conflict than any he had faced before. This was not a war for territory or treasure or dynastic claims. This was a war of cultures, of worldviews, of incompatible visions of how human beings should live. It was a war that could only end with the complete subjugation of one side or the other, with the Saxons either fully integrated into the Frankish Christian world or destroyed utterly in the attempt. The young king who had so confidently marched into Saxon territory in 772, expecting quick victory, could not have imagined that this war would consume much of his life, would demand campaign after campaign, would cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides, and would push him to acts of brutality that would stain his legacy forever. The Saxon Wars had begun, and they would not end for 3 decades. In the spring of 773, as Charles prepared for another campaign against the Saxons, a desperate message arrived from Rome that would change everything. Pope Adrian I, successor to the papacy and guardian of Christendom's spiritual heart, sent urgent appeals across the Alps. The Lombards, under King Desiderius, the same Desiderius whose daughter Charles had so unceremoniously rejected, were tightening their grip around Rome itself, threatening the Papal States, demanding territories that belonged to St. Peter. The timing was no coincidence. Desiderius had harbored Charlemagne's widow and children for 2 years now, and he saw in them a tool to undermine Charles's authority. He pressured the Pope to anoint Charlemagne's sons as rightful kings of the Franks, to declare Charles's seizure of power illegitimate. It was a bold gambit, one that threatened to unravel everything Charles had built since his brother's death. The Pope, caught between Lombard aggression and Frankish protection, needed Charles to act. For Charles, the situation presented both crisis and opportunity. The alliance between the Carolingian dynasty and the papacy was the foundation of his legitimacy, the sacred bond that made him more than just another barbarian warlord with a strong sword arm. If he failed to protect the Pope, that legitimacy crumbled. But if he succeeded, if he could crush the Lombards and secure Italy, he would accomplish what no Frankish king had done before, extend his rule beyond the Alps into the civilized heartland of the old Roman Empire. He made his decision with characteristic swiftness. The Saxon campaign could wait. In the autumn of 773, Charles gathered the largest army he had yet assembled and marched toward the Alps. His mother Bertrada, seeing her diplomatic work unravel and perhaps fearing the bloodshed to come, made one last attempt at peaceful resolution. Traveling to meet Desiderius and plead for compromise, she failed. Some conflicts cannot be negotiated away. The crossing of the Alps was a feat that evoked memories of Hannibal's legendary march. The passes were narrow and treacherous, easily defended by a determined enemy. Desiderius had garrisoned the key routes, confident that the mountains themselves would be his greatest ally. But Charles divided his forces, sending one contingent through the main pass, while another took a lesser-known route, guided by local knowledge and determination. The Lombards, suddenly facing attack from an unexpected direction, abandoned their positions and retreated. It was a pattern Charles would employ throughout his career: bold maneuvers, multiple approaches, refusing to be constrained by conventional military wisdom. By the time the Lombard forces realized what had happened, Charles's army was already descending into the Po Valley, the rich heartland of northern Italy, spreading before them like a prize waiting to be claimed. Desiderius retreated to Pavia, the Lombard capital, confident in its formidable defenses. Charles laid siege, settling in for what everyone expected would be a long wait. Medieval sieges were wars of attrition, tests of patience more than valor, and Pavia's walls were strong. But Charles used the time productively, sending detachments to secure other Lombard cities, accepting the submission of nobles who saw which way the wind was blowing, systematically dismantling Desiderius's kingdom piece by piece. During that winter of 773-774, while his army sat before Pavia, Charles traveled to Rome. It was Easter season, and the meeting between king and pope was staged with all the ceremonial magnificence that Rome could still muster. Charles, the tall Frank whose Latin was rough and whose manners were more warrior than courtier, walked the ancient streets where emperors had once processed in triumph. Pope Adrian received him with honors befitting a protector and savior, and Charles, in turn, confirmed and expanded the territorial grants that his father had made to the papacy. It was theatre, but theatre with profound meaning. Charles was presenting himself not as a conqueror come to seize Italy, but as the rightful defender of Christendom, the strong arm that protected the Church from its enemies. The symbolism was lost on no one. Here was a northern king, descended from Germanic tribes that Rome had once considered barbarians, now standing in the Eternal City as its champion. By June of 774, Pavia's resistance collapsed. Desiderius, the king who had tried to use Charlemagne's sons as pawns in his own game, surrendered. Charles showed a mercy that surprised many. Instead of execution, he sent Desiderius to a monastery, that convenient medieval solution for unwanted rulers. Charlemagne's widow and sons disappeared from history, their fate unrecorded, perhaps also sent to monasteries, perhaps meeting darker ends. Charles did not speak of them again. But the truly revolutionary moment came next. Charles did not install a puppet king or simply extract tribute and leave. He took the Iron Crown of Lombardy and placed it on his own head, declaring himself Rex Langobardorum, King of the Lombards. Two kingdoms now, Frank and Lombard, united under one ruler. It was unprecedented, audacious, and it worked. Italy, the peninsula that had been Rome's heart, was now his. The dream of empire, never spoken aloud but surely forming in Charles's mind, had taken its first real step toward reality. Yet, even as Charles secured his Italian triumph, the north burned. The Saxons, learning that the Frankish king was occupied beyond the Alps, had risen again in rebellion, and this time their fury knew no bounds. They swept through Frankish territories along the Rhine, burning churches and monasteries, slaughtering missionaries, destroying everything that represented the Christian order Charles had tried to impose. It was as if the previous years of submission had never been, as if every oath sworn and every hostage given had been merely a tactical pause before the real war resumed. Charles returned from Italy to find his northern frontier in chaos. His response would define not just the Saxon wars, but would reveal the darker aspects of his character, the ruthless pragmatism that lurked beneath the Christian king's pious exterior. This was no longer about extending his kingdom or spreading the faith. This had become personal, a test of wills between a king who demanded absolute submission and a people who valued freedom above life itself. The campaigns of the late 770s and early 780s took on a systematic brutality. Charles no longer sought merely to defeat Saxon warriors in battle. He sought to break the Saxon people entirely, to destroy their ability to resist, to transform them whether they willed it or not. His armies marched through Saxon territory year after year, burning villages, seizing hostages, destroying crops, making the cost of resistance so terrible that submission would seem the only rational choice. He imposed the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a legal code of stunning harshness. Death was prescribed for refusing baptism, for eating meat during Lent, for cremating the dead according to pagan custom, for plotting against Christians, even for refusing to attend church. The law made being Saxon and remaining true to Saxon tradition a capital crime. It was not conquest, it was cultural annihilation wrapped in religious justification. But the Saxons had a leader who embodied their spirit of resistance, a chieftain named Widukind. History has preserved little about him beyond his role as Charles's great adversary, but his name became a rallying cry, a symbol of Saxon freedom. Wherever Widukind went, rebellion followed. He was clever enough never to face Charles's main army in pitched battle, wise enough to strike when and where the Franks were weakest, bold enough to keep hope alive even in the darkest hours. The warfare took on a horrible rhythm. Charles would campaign during the summer months, when the forests were passable and armies could be supplied. The Saxons would submit, surrender hostages, accept baptism in mass ceremonies that meant nothing to them beyond temporary survival. Charles would withdraw for the winter or to deal with other threats. And then, come spring, Widukind would emerge from whatever sanctuary had sheltered him. Denmark, perhaps, or deep in the Saxon heartland, and the rebellion would ignite anew. In 782, frustration boiled over into atrocity. A Frankish force under Charles's lieutenants was ambushed and destroyed at the Suntal Hills, a shocking defeat that killed multiple Frankish nobles. Charles's response was swift and terrible. He gathered 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verden, men who had been involved in the rebellion or were suspected of supporting Widukind. In a single day, he had them all beheaded. The massacre of Verden echoes down through history as one of the darkest moments of Charles's reign. Even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, it was excessive, a war crime by any measure. The sources disagree on details. Some suggest the number was smaller, others that deportation rather than execution was the punishment, but the core horror remains. Charles, the Christian king, the protector of the church, had ordered mass execution on a scale that shocked even his own contemporaries. Yet the massacre did not end the war. If anything, it hardened Saxon resistance, proving that submission meant not peace, but destruction of everything they held dear. The war ground on year after year, consuming lives and resources, draining Charles's energy even as he pursued other conquests. It became a war without glory, a necessary but thankless labor, the price of building an empire that would accept no borders. Finally, in 785, exhaustion brought what force could not. Widukind, the eternal rebel, emerged from hiding and sued for peace. But this time, the terms were different. Charles did not demand unconditional surrender. He offered, in his way, reconciliation. Widukind accepted baptism, with Charles himself standing as godfather, a symbolic bond that carried weight in that deeply Christian age. The great Saxon leader became, at least nominally, a Christian and a subject of the Frankish king. The gesture brought a temporary peace, but the Saxon wars were far from over. They would flare up again in the 790s, requiring yet more campaigns, more deportations, more forced conversions. It would take until 804, 32 years after that first campaign, before Charles could finally claim the Saxons were truly pacified. By then, he had deported thousands of Saxons to other parts of his empire, settled Frankish and Slavic peoples in Saxon lands, built fortresses and monasteries throughout the region, and fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of northern Germany. The cost in human suffering was immense, incalculable, but Charles had achieved his goal. The Saxons were Christian, they were Frankish subjects, and they would, in time, become integral parts of the empire he was building. The old gods were forgotten, the sacred groves cut down, the ancient ways abandoned. Whether this was triumph or tragedy depends perhaps on whose story you choose to hear. While the Saxon wars consumed much of Charles's attention, his gaze was drawn southward as well, toward the Iberian Peninsula, where Muslim emirs ruled territories that had once been Visigothic and Christian. In 777, opportunity seemed to present itself in the form of internal Islamic politics. Several Muslim governors in northern Spain, embroiled in conflicts with the emir of Córdoba, sent envoys to Charles offering their submission if he would help them against their rivals. It was an irresistible prospect, the chance to strike a blow against Islam, to recover Christian lands, to extend Frankish power across the Pyrenees, and perhaps to claim the glory that his grandfather Charles Martel had won by stopping Muslim expansion at Tours. In 778, Charles gathered a massive army and crossed the Pyrenees in 2 columns, he himself leading the main force towards Zaragoza, while a secondary force secured the western passes. But from the beginning, The Spanish expedition went wrong in ways that the Saxon and Italian campaigns never had. The Muslim governors who had invited Charles proved less reliable than hoped. Zaragoza, which was supposed to open its gates, remained stubbornly closed. The local politics were more complex than Charles had understood, the alliances more fluid, the promises made by distant emirs impossible to enforce. Charles found himself sitting before Zaragoza's walls with an army that was running short of supplies, in hostile territory, facing an enemy that showed no signs of submission. Worse, news arrived from the north. The Saxons, learning of Charles's absence, had risen in yet another rebellion. The logistics of the Spanish campaign were proving nightmarish. Supply lines stretched across mountains, troops suffering in the unfamiliar heat, the whole enterprise revealing itself as poorly planned and worse executed. Charles, who had succeeded through boldness and decisive action in Italy and against the Saxons, found that sometimes boldness is not enough. He made the painful decision to withdraw. The great expedition that was meant to expand Christian territory and humble Muslim power ended in frustration and retreat. Charles pulled his army back across the Pyrenees, salvaging what he could from a campaign that had promised much and delivered nothing. But the disasters of the Spanish expedition were not yet complete. As the Frankish army wound through the Pyrenean passes, the rearguard, commanded by some of Charles's most trusted nobles, came under attack at a place called Roncevaux. The attackers were not Muslims but Basques, Christian locals who saw in the retreating Frankish army a target for plunder and an opportunity to strike against foreign invaders. The narrow pass became a killing ground, the terrain making it impossible for the main army to wheel back and provide support. The rearguard was annihilated. Among the dead was Roland, Count of the Breton March, a noble whose death would become legendary. His sacrifice and that of his companions would be transformed over the centuries into the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, an epic poem that turned military disaster into tales of heroism, that made the dead into martyrs and the defeat into a moral victory. But in the moment it was simply catastrophe, good men dead, their bodies stripped by Basque raiders, Charles's first major military humiliation. The king who returned from Spain in late 778 was a chastened man. He had learned that not every kingdom could be conquered, that not every opportunity was genuine, that even the greatest king could overreach. The Spanish expedition had cost him men, treasure, and prestige. It had revealed the limits of Frankish power and the dangers of extending forces too far from their base. Yet Charles did not abandon his ambitions in Spain entirely. In the years that followed, he took a more measured approach, establishing what came to be called the Spanish March, a buffer zone of counties along the Pyrenean frontier, populated by Spanish Christians fleeing Muslim rule and governed by Frankish counts who owed him direct allegiance. Barcelona was captured in 801, becoming the anchor of Frankish power in the region. The Spanish March never became the great conquest that Charles had envisioned in 757. It remained a frontier, a borderland where Frankish, Muslim, and Basque cultures mixed uneasily, where warfare was endemic but rarely decisive, where counts operated with considerable autonomy out of sheer necessity. But it served its purpose. It protected southern Francia from raids, provided a base for Christian refugees, and maintained pressure on Muslim Spain without requiring constant royal attention. The disaster at Roncevaux Pass taught Charles a valuable lesson about the limits of power and the importance of understanding local conditions before launching military adventures. It was a lesson he seems to have taken to heart. His later campaigns would be characterized by better preparation, more reliable intelligence, and a clearer understanding of what could realistically be achieved. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from the battles we win, but from the defeats that teach us wisdom. As the 780s progressed, Charles's ambitions turned eastward, toward territories that would complete the transformation of his Frankish kingdom into something that truly deserved the name empire. Bavaria, nominally subject to Frankish overlordship, had grown increasingly independent under Duke Tassilo III, who ruled more like a sovereign king than a vassal. Beyond Bavaria lay the Avar Khaganate, mysterious and wealthy, descendants of Central Asian nomads who had settled in the Carpathian Basin and grown rich from controlling trade routes and extracting tribute. Tassilo of Bavaria had married Desiderius's daughter. Liutperga, yes, the same Desiderius whom Charles had dethroned in Italy, and this connection had long made him suspect in Charles's eyes. Tassilo walked a dangerous tightrope, trying to maintain Bavarian autonomy while avoiding open conflict with the overwhelmingly powerful Frankish king. But by 787, Charles had decided that even nominal independence was too much. Bavaria's strategic location, controlling the Alpine passes and the approaches to Italy, made it too important to leave in potentially hostile hands. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Charles assembled his army and marched on Bavaria from 3 directions simultaneously, a massive show of force that left Tassilo with no realistic option but submission. The Bavarian duke surrendered, was brought before an assembly of Frankish nobles, and was condemned for various offences including desertion from a military campaign years earlier. Charles showed mercy of a sort. Tassilo was allowed to retire to a monastery rather than face execution. Bavaria was absorbed into the Frankish realm. Its independence ended, its ducal line extinguished, but conquering Bavaria was merely the prelude to the greater prize beyond. The Avars had ruled the Hungarian plain for 2 centuries, building a vast ring fortress called the Hring, where they stored the accumulated wealth of generations: gold, silver, precious fabrics, the plunder of countless raids, and the tribute of subjugated peoples. They were formidable warriors, heirs to the Hun military tradition, masters of mounted archery and swift cavalry tactics. But by the late 8th century, internal conflicts had weakened them, and Charles saw opportunity. The Avar campaigns of 791–796 were unlike anything Charles had attempted before. This was warfare on the Great Plains against an enemy who fought like no one the Franks had previously faced. Charles approached the challenge with characteristic thoroughness, building a supply infrastructure, coordinating multiple armies, and pressing forward despite terrain and enemies that would have defeated a less determined commander. The first major campaign in 791 pushed deep into Avar territory, but achieved no decisive result. The Avars simply retreated before the Frankish advance, unwilling to risk everything in a pitched battle, content to let distance and logistics be their allies. But Charles persisted, sending campaign after campaign, slowly tightening the noose, exploiting internal Avar divisions, offering generous terms to those who would submit. In 795–796, his armies finally broke through to the Hring itself, the legendary fortress that held the accumulated wealth of centuries. What they found exceeded the wildest expectations. Wagon after wagon was loaded with treasure and sent back to Francia. The plunder was so vast that it transformed the Frankish economy, providing Charles with resources to fund his other projects, to reward his nobles lavishly, to build churches and monasteries, to present gifts that dazzled foreign envoys. The Avar treasure became legendary, spoken of in awed tones throughout Europe. But more important than the gold was the strategic result. The Avar Khaganate collapsed, its power broken forever, its people absorbed into the Frankish realm or scattered to the winds. The Hungarian plain, that vast territory that had been closed to Western control since the fall of Rome, was now open to Frankish settlement and administration. The empire's eastern frontier had been pushed hundreds of miles beyond where any previous Frankish king had reached. By the end of the 8th century, Charles ruled territories that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the plains of Hungary. from the North Sea to Rome, from the Pyrenees to the Baltic approaches. It was not yet called an empire, that would come later, but in every practical sense that is what it had become. Dozens of peoples, multiple cultures, vast resources, all united under one king's authority. The boy who had inherited a divided kingdom 30 years earlier had built something unprecedented in post-Roman Europe. Through relentless campaigning, shrewd diplomacy, ruthless elimination of rivals, and sheer force of will, he had created a realm that rivaled anything seen in the West since the Caesars. And yet, the greatest moment of his reign still lay ahead, waiting for him in Rome on a Christmas morning that would change the course of European history. There are moments in history when the world pivots on its axis, when the past and future converge in a single instant that changes everything that follows. Christmas Day in the year 800 was such a moment, though no one present could have fully grasped the magnitude of what was about to unfold in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. Charles had arrived in the Eternal City in late November, his fourth visit to Rome, but by far the most consequential. Pope Leo III, who had ascended to the papacy in 795, was in desperate straits. The Roman nobility, never comfortable with papal authority when it threatened their own power, had turned against him with vicious intensity. Earlier that year, Leo had been attacked in the streets during a religious procession, beaten and left for dead, accused of various crimes by his enemies who sought to depose him. The Pope had escaped and fled north, making the long journey across the Alps to seek Charles's protection at Paderborn in Saxony. It was a moment heavy with symbolism, the spiritual head of Christendom forced to beg aid from a Germanic king, the successor of St. Peter dependent on Frankish swords for his very survival. Charles had received him with honor, promised protection, and in the summer of 800 sent him back to Rome with a Frankish escort. But Charles understood that the matter could not rest there. The allegations against Leo, whether true or fabricated, had to be addressed. A pope whose legitimacy was questioned could not effectively lead the church, and Charles's own authority rested in part on papal sanction. And so he traveled to Rome himself, arriving with sufficient military force to make clear that he came not as a supplicant, but as the protector, and, in practical terms, the arbiter of the papacy's fate. For weeks, a council deliberated the charges against Leo. It was unprecedented territory. No one quite knew how to proceed with putting a pope on trial, for who had authority to judge the successor of St. Peter? In the end, Leo was allowed to purge himself through oath, swearing his innocence before God and the assembled clergy. The charges were dismissed, the Pope's enemies were dealt with, and Leo's position was secured. But everyone understood the reality. Charles had saved the papacy, and the debt could only be repaid in the most extraordinary coin. Christmas Day dawned cold and clear. Charles attended Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, that ancient structure built by Constantine himself over the supposed tomb of the Apostle. He prayed at the altar, his mind perhaps on the long journey that had brought him here, from a prince sharing a divided kingdom to the master of most of Christian Europe. The liturgy proceeded with its familiar rhythms, the ancient words spoken in Latin, incense rising toward the vaulted ceiling. And then, as Charles rose from prayer, Pope Leo approached carrying a golden crown. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. According to Einhard, Charles's biographer and confidant, the king was surprised, even displeased by what followed, claiming that had he known the Pope's intention, he would not have entered the church that day. But whether surprise or orchestrated theatre, the moment unfolded with irrevocable finality. Leo placed the crown upon Charles's head and proclaimed him Imperator Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. The congregation erupted in acclamation, the traditional cry that had greeted Roman emperors for centuries. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans, life and victory. 3 times they cried it, the words echoing through the basilica, witnessed by Frankish nobles and Roman clergy, by the Pope himself, and by God above. In that instant, something impossible became real. The Roman Empire, fallen in the West for more than 3 centuries, was reborn. Or perhaps it had never truly fallen. Perhaps it had only slept, waiting for a man worthy to wear the purple to restore what had been lost. The translatio imperii, the transfer of empire, had occurred. The ancient dignity that had passed from Rome to Constantinople now passed again, this time to a Germanic king who could barely read Latin, but who had conquered more territory than any ruler since the Caesars. Charles knelt before the Pope, whether in genuine humility or political theatre, we cannot know, and Leo anointed him with holy oil, sealing the coronation with the Church's most sacred blessing. The king of the Franks and Lombards was now emperor. His authority transformed from mere temporal power into something that claimed universal dominion, at least over the Christian West, yet the moment carried profound complications. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire still existed, still called itself Roman, still had emperors who traced their authority in unbroken succession back to Constantine and Augustus. The coronation of 800 was, from their perspective, an act of rebellion, of usurpation, a barbarian pretender stealing a title that belonged to them alone. It would poison relations between East and West for years, contributing to the long drift that would eventually split Christianity itself. But in that moment, as the acclamations faded and Charles wore the crown that made him emperor, such future troubles seemed distant. He had reached a pinnacle that no Germanic king had touched before. The dream of empire, barely articulated in his youth, realized through decades of warfare and diplomacy, was now consecrated by the highest authority on earth. Charles Augustus, emperor of the Romans, protector of the Church, successor to Constantine and Justinian, master of the West. History had turned a page. The Middle Ages had truly begun. For all his military achievements, for all the territories conquered and peoples subdued, perhaps Charles's most lasting legacy emerged not from battlefields but from scriptoriums and schools, from the quiet revolution in learning that historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. It was a renaissance born from irony. An emperor who struggled to write his own name became the greatest patron of literacy and learning that Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Charles understood, with the clarity that marked his greatest insights, that empire required more than swords. It required administration, communication, record-keeping, law. It required clergy who could read the scriptures they preached, monks who could copy texts accurately, administrators who could manage the complex machinery of government. And when he looked across his vast domains, he saw a landscape of profound ignorance, where even many priests could barely stumble through the Latin liturgy, where ancient texts were copied so carelessly that they became corrupted beyond recognition, where learning had retreated to a few isolated monasteries that guarded their knowledge like misers hoarding gold. He set about changing this with the same systematic determination he brought to military campaigns. In 782, he issued a summons that would echo through the centuries. He called to his court the finest minds he could find, offering them generous support, protection, and the resources to pursue their scholarly work. They came from across Europe and beyond: Alcuin of York from Anglo-Saxon England, Theodulf from Visigothic Spain, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Peter of Pisa, Einhard from Germania, and others whose names have been preserved in the grateful memory of those who came after. Alcuin, in particular, became the architect of Charles's educational reforms. This Northumbrian monk, already elderly when he arrived at the Frankish court, brought with him the learning traditions of Anglo-Saxon England, which had preserved more of classical knowledge than continental Europe. He became Charles's friend, advisor, and the master of the palace school at Aachen, where he taught not just the children of nobles, but engaged in learned debates with the emperor himself. The palace school became the model for reform throughout the empire. Charles mandated that every cathedral and monastery should establish a school, that clergy should be properly educated, that boys of talent should be taught regardless of their birth. It was not universal education as we would understand it. Women were largely excluded, and peasant children rarely had access, but it was revolutionary for its time. The idea that learning should be systematically cultivated rather than left to chance. The reforms extended to the very letters on the page. Medieval scribes had developed various handwriting styles, many of them cramped and difficult to read, with little standardization and frequent ambiguity. Under Charles's patronage, scholars developed what came to be called Carolingian minuscule, a clear, standardized script that made text far easier to read and copy accurately. It seems a small thing, perhaps, a mere matter of penmanship. But this innovation preserved countless texts that might otherwise have been lost to corruption, and it laid the foundation for the lowercase letters we still use today. The scriptoriums of Carolingian monasteries became factories of preservation. Teams of monks labored year after year, copying not just Christian texts, but pagan classics, Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Seneca, works that the Church might have viewed with suspicion, but that Charles understood as part of the educational foundation any civilized person required. Most of the classical Latin literature that survives today does so because Carolingian scribes copied it. The ancient world speaks to us through their careful hands. Charles himself participated in this intellectual life with touching enthusiasm despite his limited education. He kept tablets under his pillow, practicing his letters at night, struggling to master the writing skills that should have been learned in childhood. He never quite succeeded. Einhard tells us that he tried too late in life, that his hand never achieved the fluency he desired. But he could read, he could follow theological debates, and he participated eagerly in the learned discussions at his court, asking questions, challenging assumptions, demanding clarity. The emperor established a standardized curriculum based on the classical trivium and quadrivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These 7 liberal arts became the foundation of medieval education, the structure that would be carried forward through the centuries into the universities of the High Middle Ages. Every cathedral school, every monastery that followed the Carolingian model taught this curriculum, creating for the first time since Rome a common educational culture across Western Europe. But the reforms went beyond mere learning. Charles sought to standardize religious practice itself to ensure that Mass was celebrated the same way throughout his empire, that the liturgy was correct, that ecclesiastical discipline was uniform. He imported Roman chant traditions, leading to what we now call Gregorian chant. He mandated reforms in monastic life based on the rule of Saint Benedict. He insisted on celibacy for clergy and proper conduct for priests. It was an ambitious program, one that often met resistance from those comfortable with local traditions and suspicious of imposed uniformity. Not all of it succeeded. Medieval diversity proved stronger than imperial will in many cases, but the attempt itself was remarkable. Charles envisioned a unified Christian civilization, bound together not just by political authority, but by shared culture, common learning, and standardized practice. The irony, of course, is that this flowering of learning occurred under the patronage of a man who embodied the warrior culture that had replaced Roman civilization. Charles was, at heart, a Frank, a Germanic warlord who happened to rule an empire. He never lost his love of hunting and feasting, of warrior camaraderie and martial valor. His court combined classical learning with Germanic customs in ways that must have seemed bizarre to those formed in either tradition alone. Yet, perhaps that combination was precisely what made the Carolingian Renaissance possible. A purely Roman scholar might have looked backward, trying to resurrect the past unchanged. Charles, standing between two worlds, could take what was valuable from both and forge something new. The result was not a restoration of Roman civilization, but the creation of something distinct, a Christian, Latin, yet fundamentally medieval culture that would shape Europe for centuries to come. An empire is not merely conquered, it must be built, administered, made to function as a coherent whole rather than a collection of subjugated territories held together only by force. Charles understood this with a clarity that separated him from mere conquerors. He spent as much energy organizing his domains as he did expanding them, creating the administrative and legal structures that would outlast his own lifetime and shape medieval Europe's political development. The center of this empire, its beating heart, was Aachen. Charles had loved this place since his youth. The hot springs, the hunting forests nearby, the strategic location in the Frankish heartland. As emperor, he transformed it from a modest royal estate into something approaching an imperial capital, building a palace complex that deliberately echoed Rome and Constantinople, announcing through architecture that a new empire had risen in the west. The centerpiece was the Palatine Chapel, an octagonal structure that still stands today, a testament to Carolingian ambition. Its design borrowed from Byzantine models, particularly San Vitale in Ravenna, but the execution was distinctly Western. Columns and marbles were imported from Rome and Ravenna, physical fragments of the old empire incorporated into the new. The chapel's galleries allowed Charles to observe Mass from above, separated from the common worshippers, participating in the liturgy, yet visibly set apart by his imperial dignity. Around the chapel spread the palace complex, halls for feasting and administration, living quarters, libraries, schools, stables, workshops. It was a complete center of government from which Charles directed his vast empire, received embassies from as far as Baghdad and Constantinople, issued the capitularies and decrees that carried his will across thousands of miles. When he was in residence, Aachen became the most important place in Western Christendom, the point where all power concentrated. But Charles knew that he could not govern his empire from Aachen alone. The territories were too vast, communications too slow, local powers too entrenched. He needed a system that could extend his authority to the furthest reaches without requiring his constant presence. The solution was characteristically practical and remarkably effective: the Missi Dominici, the messengers of the Lord. These were paired officials, typically a bishop and a count, sent out annually to tour specific regions of the empire. They traveled with full imperial authority, investigating local administration, hearing appeals from those who felt wronged by local officials, checking accounts, ensuring that imperial orders were being implemented, reporting back on conditions and problems. They were, in effect, mobile representatives of the emperor's will, his eyes and ears across an empire that no single man could personally oversee. The system was not perfect, corruption was inevitable, local powers learned to manipulate the Missi, and the emperor's reach had limits even with such mechanisms. But it worked better than anything Western Europe had seen since Roman times. It created a framework for centralized administration that influenced governmental development for centuries, establishing the principle that royal authority should be regular, predictable, and subject to inspection. Charles also worked to standardize law across his domains, a monumental task given the diversity of peoples and customs under his rule. He did not attempt to replace local laws entirely, that would have been impossible, and invited rebellion, but he issued capitularies, collections of decrees on specific matters that applied throughout the empire. These covered everything from weights and measures to ecclesiastical discipline, from military obligations to treatment of merchants. The Carolingian legal system recognized different laws for different peoples. Franks lived under Frankish law, Lombards under Lombard law, Saxons under Saxon law, but it imposed a superstructure of imperial legislation that applied to all. It was a sophisticated approach, acknowledging local diversity while asserting overarching unity, and it established legal principles that would echo through medieval Europe. Currency reform was another pillar of Charles's administrative work. He established a standard silver penny, the denarius, that became the basis for Carolingian coinage and, through its descendants, influenced European monetary systems for centuries. The livre, sou, and denier of medieval France, the pounds, shillings, and pence of England all traced their origins to Carolingian monetary reforms. Standardized coinage facilitated trade, simplified taxation, and proclaimed the emperor's authority in the most tangible way, literally stamped on every coin that changed hands. Charles concerned himself with infrastructure as well, ordering the maintenance and construction of roads and bridges, attempting to create a canal linking the Rhine and Danube river systems, encouraging trade and the movement of goods. Not all these projects succeeded. The canal proved beyond the engineering capabilities of the age, but the attempt revealed the scope of his vision, the desire to create not just an empire of conquest, but a functioning economic and administrative unit. He also sought to protect the vulnerable within his domains, issuing laws against the oppression of widows and orphans, limiting the power of lords over their dependents, establishing the principle that justice should be available to all, not just the powerful. Whether these laws were effectively enforced is questionable. Medieval reality often fell far short of royal decrees, but the articulation of such principles mattered, establishing standards against which reality could be measured and found wanting. Religious reform was inseparable from administrative organization. Charles saw the church not just as a spiritual institution, but as a crucial mechanism of imperial governance. Bishops were his administrators as much as they were shepherds of souls. Monasteries were centers of learning and economic production, as well as houses of prayer. He appointed bishops, convened church councils, involved himself in theological disputes, insisted that clergy meet minimum standards of education and conduct. The fusion of church and state, spiritual and temporal authority, reached a culmination under Charles that would define medieval Christianity. Caesaropapism, the Byzantine model where the emperor controlled the church, mixed with the Western tradition of papal independence to create something new. An empire that was self-consciously Christian, where the emperor was protector and patron of the faith, where political and religious authority supported each other in elaborate interdependence. By the first decade of the 9th century, Charles had created something unprecedented. It was not Rome reborn. Too much had changed, too many centuries had passed, but it was a functional empire, administered with reasonable efficiency, governed by law rather than mere force, capable of maintaining itself across vast territories and diverse peoples. It was the foundation upon which medieval Europe would build, the model that would be imitated and adapted and argued over for centuries after its creator had returned to dust. Behind every crown, beneath every imperial title, there beats a human heart, subject to the same joys and sorrows, the same loves and losses that mark all human existence. Charles, for all his conquests and reforms, for all the territories he ruled and the power he wielded, was ultimately a man, a father, a husband, a human being who felt deeply the weight of both his responsibilities and his personal attachments. He married 5 times over the course of his life, though medieval sources are sometimes unclear about the exact chronology and status of these unions. After repudiating Desiderius's daughter in that calculated political insult, he married Hildegard of Windsgau, a union that proved both politically useful and personally fulfilling. Hildegard was young when they married, barely into her teens by modern standards, yet she proved herself a worthy partner, to an emperor. She traveled with him on campaigns, bore him 9 children, and died in 783 at the age of only 25, worn out by constant childbearing and the demands of life at an itinerant court. Her death devastated Charles. Einhard tells us that the emperor wept openly, that his grief was profound and visible, unashamed in an age when powerful men were expected to show stoic restraint. He had loved her, truly loved her, and her loss left a void that subsequent marriages never quite filled. Within months, he married again, Fastrada, a Frankish noblewoman, but contemporaries noted that his manner changed after Hildegard's death, that he became harsher, more willing to resort to severity, as if some gentling influence had been removed. His children were numerous, legitimate and illegitimate both, for Charles followed the Frankish custom of maintaining concubines alongside his official wives, and he acknowledged and provided for all his offspring. He had at least 18 children that we know of, perhaps more, whose names have been lost to history. Sons were groomed for rule, trained in warfare and statecraft, given territories to govern as sub-kings under their father's overall authority. Daughters were educated, cultured, brought up in the palace school where they learned Latin and could participate in the intellectual life of the court. But with the daughters, Charles did something remarkable and, from a political standpoint, nearly incomprehensible. He refused to let them marry. Despite offers from kings and nobles across Europe, despite the diplomatic advantages such marriages could have secured, Charles kept his daughters at his court, unmarried, bound to him by affection and his unwillingness to let them go. Einhard attributes this to excessive love, to Charles's inability to part with those dear to him. And there is surely truth in this. Yet the result was complicated and, by medieval standards, scandalous. Several of Charles's daughters took lovers from among the court nobles, bearing children outside of marriage. One daughter, Bertha, had a long-term relationship with Angilbert, one of Charles's closest advisors and a renowned scholar. Another, Rotrud, bore children to Count Rorico of Maine. Charles acknowledged these grandchildren, allowed the relationships to continue, seemingly willing to accept this arrangement rather than lose his daughters to distant courts through marriage. It reveals something deeply human about the emperor, the man who could order thousands executed, who could wage war for decades without flinching, who ruled with iron determination. This same man could not bear to part with his daughters. It was a weakness, perhaps, certainly a blind spot that complicated succession and created awkward situations at court. But it was also profoundly touching, a glimpse of genuine paternal love in an age when political calculation usually trumped personal feeling. His sons were another matter. They were assets to be deployed, extensions of his will, trained to rule the territories they would inherit. Charles created sub-kingdoms for them, Italy for Pepper, Aquitaine for Louis, Bavaria for another Pepper who died young. They led armies, administered justice, learned to govern under their father's watchful eye. It was practical training for succession, preparing them for the day when the empire would pass to the next generation. But parenthood brought Charles not only joy, but profound grief. Children died with terrible frequency in the medieval world, and Charles, despite all his power, could not protect his offspring from disease and death. His beloved son, Pepin, King of Italy, died in 810 at only 33 years old. Charles, King of the Franks, his namesake and eldest son, died the same year at about 36. Within a single year, the emperor lost 2 of his 3 legitimate sons, watching the carefully constructed succession plan crumble. The grief must have been crushing. Charles was in his late 60s by then, an old man by medieval standards, and he was watching his children precede him to the grave. All the territories conquered, all the glory won, all the achievements of a lifetime. What did any of it matter if those he loved most could not be protected, if death could take his children despite all his power and will. He took pleasure in simple things despite the weight of empire. He loved swimming in the hot springs at Aachen, so much so that he built the palace there specifically to be near them. He would swim with his sons, his nobles, even his bodyguards, stripping away rank and dignity to splash in the warm water like any other man seeking relief from aches and cares. He loved hunting, riding through forests in pursuit of game, maintaining the warrior vigor of his youth even as his body aged. He loved feasting, surrounding himself with companions, listening to music and stories, maintaining the Germanic custom of communal meals where king and nobles sat together in boisterous fellowship. His physical presence commanded attention. Contemporary descriptions tell us he was tall, very tall for his era, perhaps 6 feet 3 or 4 inches, with a thick neck, a protruding belly in his later years, a voice higher than his size would suggest. He dressed simply for a king, preferring traditional Frankish costume, linen tunic and breeches, cross-gartered with leather straps, though for formal occasions he would don the elaborate Byzantine-style robes that imperial dignity required. He ate and drank moderately, except when it came to roasted meat, which he loved and could never resist. His doctors advised him to eat boiled meat instead, claiming it was healthier, but Charles ignored them on this point with the stubbornness that marked his character. Even an emperor, it seemed, deserved some small rebellion against those who would manage every aspect of his life. In his final years, as sons died and old age crept upon him, Charles spent more time at Aachen, less time on the endless campaigns that had defined his reign. He surrounded himself with family, with the scholars and advisors who had become his companions, with the familiar rhythms of palace life. He continued to govern, to issue decrees, to manage the vast machinery of empire, but there was a sense of withdrawal, of a man preparing for the transition that awaits all mortals no matter how high they rise. The emperor was still human, still subject to love and loss, still capable of being moved by simple pleasures and devastated by profound grief. The man behind the crown was, in the end, simply a man, extraordinary in his achievements but ordinary in his humanity, powerful beyond measure yet powerless to protect those he loved most from the one enemy that defeats all earthly authority. There is a profound loneliness that comes with absolute power, an isolation born not from lack of company, but from the burden of making decisions that affect millions, where every choice carries consequences that ripple outward like stones dropped in still water, where trust becomes a luxury that a ruler can rarely afford, and betrayal lurks even among those closest to the throne. Charles knew this loneliness intimately. For all the nobles who surrounded him, for all the advisors who offered counsel, for all the family members who shared his table, he alone bore final responsibility for the empire's fate. He alone decided matters of war and peace, life and death, the rise and fall of dynasties. It was a weight that grew heavier with each passing year, a burden that bent even his strong shoulders as age advanced. The empire's very size created problems that no amount of administrative innovation could fully solve. Communication across such vast territories was measured in weeks or months, not hours or days. By the time word of a crisis reached the emperor and he issued instructions in response, circumstances had often changed dramatically. Local officials exercised enormous discretion out of sheer necessity, and that discretion could shade into abuse, into corruption, into the pursuit of private interests at the expense of imperial policy. Rebellion was a constant threat, sometimes open and violent, more often subtle and insidious, the slow erosion of imperial authority through local resistance, through nobles who paid lip service to commands they had no intention of obeying, through the endless negotiations and compromises that characterized medieval governance. Charles spent much of his reign fighting not just foreign enemies, but the centrifugal forces within his own domains, trying to hold together territories that pulled constantly toward independence. The most painful rebellion came from within his own family. Pepin, his eldest son by a concubine before his marriage to Hildegard, had been passed over in the succession in favor of the legitimate sons. Pepin was hunchbacked, a physical deformity that medieval society saw as both mark and symbol of inner corruption, and Charles, in a decision that mixed practical politics with personal cruelty, had essentially excluded him from power. The boy was given a modest position, but nothing approaching his royal birth status. In 792, Pepin the Hunchback, as history cruelly names him, joined a conspiracy of Frankish nobles who sought to overthrow Charles and place Pepin on the throne. The conspiracy was broad, involving important figures at court, speaking to deeper dissatisfactions with Charles's increasingly autocratic rule. Perhaps they resented the favoritism shown to legitimate sons, or chafed under the endless demands for military service, or simply saw opportunity in an empire that seemed overextended and vulnerable. The plot was discovered before it could be executed. Charles's response was characteristically decisive and, by his standards, merciful. Most of the conspirators were executed or blinded, that peculiarly medieval punishment that removed a man's ability to function in warfare or governance while technically preserving his life. But Pepin, his own son, was spared execution. Instead, Charles had him tonsured, forcibly ordained as a monk, and sent to a monastery for the rest of his life. It was mercy of a sort, but imagine the pain on both sides. A father betrayed by his son, forced to choose between familial love and the stability of the realm. A son rejected and humiliated, sent to spend his remaining years in monastic confinement, alive but dead to the world, his ambitions crushed, his very existence a reminder of failure and shame. The sources say little about Charles's emotional state following this betrayal, but the silence itself speaks volumes. Some wounds cut too deep for words. The conspiracy revealed fractures in the empire's foundation. Frankish nobles, accustomed to considerable autonomy under earlier, weaker kings, resented Charles's centralizing reforms, his demands for constant military service, his interference in local affairs through the missi dominici. The conquered peoples, Saxons, Bavarians, Lombards, bore imperial rule with varying degrees of resentment, held in check by force and self-interest, but never fully reconciled to Frankish dominance. Unity was imposed from above. It did not spring naturally from the diverse populations Charles ruled. Succession loomed as an unsolvable problem. The Frankish tradition of dividing the kingdom among all legitimate sons guaranteed future conflict. Charles knew this. He had lived it with his brother Charlemagne, yet he could not escape the custom without risking alienating his nobles and undermining the foundations of Frankish kingship. In 806, he formally divided the empire among his three surviving legitimate sons. Charles would receive Francia and Saxony, Pepin would have Italy and Bavaria, Louis would get Aquitaine and the Spanish territories. It was a plan that satisfied tradition while virtually guaranteeing future civil war. The brothers would inevitably come into conflict, competing for resources and dominance, pulling the empire apart just as Charles and Charlemagne nearly had. Yet what alternative existed? To name a single heir was to invite immediate rebellion from the others and their supporters. To trust that the brothers would cooperate required a faith in human nature that Charles's long experience had surely extinguished. The emperor also faced challenges from beyond his borders. Byzantium, stung by the coronation of 800, refused to recognize Charles's imperial title for years, eventually granting grudging acknowledgement only after complex negotiations and Charles's agreement to relinquish some territorial claims in Italy. Viking raids began hitting coastal areas with increasing frequency, harbingers of the storm that would devastate Europe in the century to come. Muslim Spain remained unconquered and potentially threatening. The empire was ringed with dangers, requiring constant vigilance, endless military preparation, resources stretched thin across too many frontiers. Managing relationships with subordinate rulers consumed enormous energy. Charles had to maintain the loyalty of counts and dukes, bishops and abbots, each with their own interests and agendas, each requiring careful handling to keep them aligned with imperial policy. He had to mediate disputes, dispense justice, reward the faithful and punish the disloyal, all while projecting an image of invincible strength that would discourage rebellion. It was an endless balancing act, exhausting in its demands, allowing no rest and little trust. And beneath it all lay the question that must have haunted Charles in quiet moments. What would happen when he was gone? Who could hold this empire together? Who possessed the strength of will and the military prowess and the administrative skill and the sheer stubborn determination that empire required? His sons were capable men, but not giants. The empire he had built was, in many ways, unsustainable without him. Too large, too diverse, too dependent on the personal authority of a single, extraordinary individual. The weight of empire was crushing, not because Charles was weak, but because he was clear-sighted enough to see the problems he could not solve, wise enough to recognize the limits of power, experienced enough to know that all human achievements are temporary, that empires rise and fall, that death comes for kings as surely as for beggars. He had built something magnificent, something that would shape European history for centuries, but he also knew in his heart that it could not last forever, that entropy and human ambition and the sheer difficulty of holding diverse peoples together would eventually tear apart what he had labored so long to unite. Time, that great leveler of kings and commoners alike, pressed its weight upon Charles with increasing insistence as the new century dawned. The emperor, who had once ridden tirelessly from battlefield to battlefield, who had crossed the Alps multiple times, who had seemed possessed of inexhaustible energy, now felt the accumulated toll of 7 decades and 46 years of rule. His body, that magnificent instrument that had carried him through countless campaigns, began to betray him with the small treacheries of age. He still swam in the hot springs at Aachen, still hunted when he could, still presided over councils and dispensed justice, but the vitality that had defined him was ebbing like tide, retreating from the shore. His physicians worried over him, prescribing remedies that he largely ignored, advising changes to diet and activity that he accepted only reluctantly. Charles had never been a man who submitted easily to limitations, and age was simply another enemy to be resisted, another battle to be fought, even if the outcome was inevitable. The deaths of his sons in 810 had forced a grim recalculation of succession. The careful division he had planned in 806, that attempt to honor Frankish tradition while preserving some semblance of unity, was now impossible. Only Louis remained of his legitimate sons, Louis the Pious, as he would be known to history, the youngest and perhaps least suited to bear the weight of empire. He was a capable administrator, a devoted Christian, a man of genuine piety and learning. But he lacked his father's ruthless pragmatism, his ability to make hard choices without hesitation, his warrior's instinct for power and its maintenance. Yet there was no alternative. In 813, Charles summoned an assembly at Aachen and, in a ceremony deliberately structured to emphasize continuity and legitimacy, arranged for Louis's coronation as co-emperor. This time, significantly, no pope participated. Charles himself placed the crown upon his son's head, making clear that imperial authority derived from the Carolingian dynasty itself, not from papal sanction alone. It was a statement about power and its sources, an assertion of imperial independence that carried implications Charles might not live to see fully unfold. Father and son spent time together that year, Charles presumably sharing what wisdom he could, trying to prepare Louis for the challenges ahead. What did they speak of in those private moments? Did Charles share his doubts, his fears for the empire's future? Did he offer advice on managing fractious nobles, on balancing mercy with severity, on the endless compromises that governance requires? Or did he maintain the imperial dignity even with his son, keeping his uncertainties locked behind the facade of invincible authority? The empire Charles prepared to leave was magnificent but fragile. It stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Rome, encompassing dozens of peoples and multiple kingdoms. It had brought a degree of order, stability, and cultural flowering unprecedented since Rome's fall. The Carolingian Renaissance had preserved learning, standardized administration, spread literacy and Latin culture across territories that had been sinking into barbarism. Churches and monasteries dotted the landscape, centers of prayer and learning. Roads were maintained, justice was dispensed, trade flourished within protected borders. But the cracks were visible to anyone willing to see them. The empire was held together primarily by Charles's personal authority, by the force of his will and the fear of his armies. Would Louis command the same respect, the same fear? Would nobles who had submitted to Charles accept his son's authority with equal deference? Would conquered peoples remain pacified without the legendary warrior king to threaten them with his wrath? Viking raids, which had begun as isolated incidents, were increasing in frequency and boldness. In 810, a large Danish fleet had raided the Frisian coast, and Charles himself had ridden north to inspect the defences, staring out at the sea that would soon disgorge waves of Scandinavian warriors to ravage his empire's descendants. He understood, perhaps, that this was a threat his son would have to face, one that required different tactics than the land warfare Charles had mastered. The sea was an alien realm to the Franks, and enemies who came from it posed challenges his administrative systems were not designed to meet. The succession plan itself, concentrating all power in Louis, violated Frankish tradition and created potential for conflict. Charles's illegitimate sons, his nephews, various nobles who had expected a share of power, all now faced a future where they were mere subjects rather than princes. Some accepted this with resignation, understanding that divided inheritance had caused too many civil wars. Others harbored resentment that would blossom into rebellion once the old emperor's iron hand was removed. There were also grandsons now, sons of the dead Pepin of Italy, who had claims of their own. Charles had recognized them, provided for them, but in securing Louis's succession, he had implicitly denied their rights. It was pragmatic, perhaps even necessary, but it stored up trouble for the future, planting seeds of conflict that would sprout after Charles was safely in his grave. As 813 turned to 814, Charles must have felt the shadows gathering. He had built an empire through 4 decades of relentless effort, through warfare and diplomacy, through administrative innovation and cultural patronage, through sheer force of personality and will. He had been crowned emperor by the Pope, had corresponded with the Caliph of Baghdad as an equal, had reshaped the map of Europe and the course of Western civilization. His achievements were monumental, his legacy secure. But he was also clear-sighted enough to see that what he had built was not eternal, that empires are mortal like the men who create them, that time erodes all human works, however magnificent. The best he could hope for was that Louis would hold things together, that the administrative structures and cultural achievements would endure even if the political unity crumbled, that something of value would survive the inevitable dissolution. Winter came to Aachen in late 813, cold and dark, and Charles felt it more keenly than in previous years. He still conducted business, still issued orders, still tried to govern his vast domains from the palace he had built. But the energy was failing. The body that had served him so faithfully for more than 7 decades finally nearing the end of its strength. The emperor knew with the certainty that comes to those who have lived fully and seen much that his time was measured now not in years but in months, perhaps weeks. The wheel of fortune was turning, as it always does. The man who had risen so high, who had achieved so much, was approaching the moment that awaits all mortals, regardless of their earthly glory. Charles had conquered kingdoms, had crowned himself emperor, had reshaped civilization itself, but he could not conquer death. That enemy came for kings and beggars alike, and its approach cast long shadows across the final winter of Charlemagne's life. January of 814 arrived with bitter cold, the kind that seeps into bones and settles there, that makes even the great palace at Aachen seem inadequate against winter's assault. Charles, in his 72nd year, felt the cold more keenly than he ever had before. But it was not merely winter that afflicted him. Something deeper was wrong, some internal failing that no amount of willpower could overcome. The fever came first, sudden and severe, sending chills through his body despite the fires that blazed in the imperial chambers. His physicians gathered, those learned men who had studied at the palace school, who knew Greek and Arab medical texts, who prescribed remedies based on the theory of humours and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. They bled him, applied poultices, prepared medicines from herbs and minerals, did everything their art prescribed. Charles, who had always been impatient with medical advice, submitted now with an acquiescence that itself spoke volumes about the severity of his condition. For a week he lingered between life and death, his formidable constitution fighting the illness that had seized him. He refused food, taking only a little water and wine, as if his body understood what his will would not yet acknowledge, that the time had come to let go, to surrender the burden he had carried for so long, to pass into that darkness from which no earthly power could retrieve him. The palace moved through those days in a kind of suspended animation, nobles and clergy gathering, waiting, praying, conducting the business of empire in hushed tones, while in the imperial bedchamber, the greatest ruler of his age struggled for each breath. Louis had returned to his own kingdom in Aquitaine, having been crowned co-emperor the previous September. He would not see his father alive again. Perhaps that was for the best. Some partings are too painful to bear witness to, some deaths too private for even filial duty to intrude upon. Charles received the last rites of the Church, that final sacrament that prepares the Christian soul for its journey into eternity. He confessed his sins to a priest, and one wonders what sins weighed most heavily on his conscience. The massacre at Verdun, the forced conversions of the Saxons, the wars fought for glory as much as necessity, the families destroyed, the peoples subjugated, the blood spilled to build an empire, or perhaps more personal failures, moments of weakness, broken promises, those he had loved but failed to protect, the son who had betrayed him and whom he had sent to perpetual monastic imprisonment. We will never know what passed between Charles and his God in those final moments of consciousness. The sources preserve the public facts, the date, the illness, the religious observances, but they cannot penetrate to the interior landscape of a dying emperor's thoughts. Perhaps he faced death with the same courage he had shown in battle. Perhaps he felt relief at laying down a burden that had grown too heavy. Perhaps he experienced doubt, fear, the universal human terror at approaching the unknowable threshold. On January 28, 814, in the early morning hours when the world is darkest and quietest, Charles died. The great heart that had driven him through decades of conquest and construction finally stopped. The mind that had conceived of empire, that had balanced warfare and learning, power and piety, fell silent. The body that had seemed indomitable, that had ridden thousands of miles and wielded weapons in countless battles, became still. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, then outward across the empire with the speed that important news always travels, faster than any messenger could ride, carried by some invisible network of rumor and report. The emperor was dead. Charles the Great, Karl the Grosser, Carolus Magnus, protector of Christendom, conqueror of peoples, patron of learning, builder of empire, gone. His burial was conducted with all the ceremony befitting an emperor, yet also with surprising simplicity in accordance with his own wishes. They laid him to rest in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, the octagonal structure he had built as the centerpiece of his palace, the space that had witnessed his prayers and devotions over decades. He was not placed in a sarcophagus, but seated on a throne within a vault, dressed in imperial regalia, crown upon his head, sword at his side, gospel book on his lap, an emperor, in death as in life, ready to rise when the final trumpet sounded. The symbolism was profound. Unlike the Roman emperors whose tombs were monuments to earthly glory, Charles was buried in a church, in a space dedicated to worship, his eternal rest placed quite literally in the house of God. It announced that his empire had been, at least in conception, a Christian empire, that his authority had derived not merely from military might, but from sacred duty, that he saw himself as defender of the faith rather than merely another conqueror building monuments to personal ambition. The vault was sealed, the prayers were spoken, the rituals were completed. The nobles and clergy who had gathered dispersed to their own territories, uncertain now of what the future held without the towering figure who had dominated their world for so long. The palace at Aachen continued to function. Administrations do not stop simply because their master has died, but the center had been removed, the animating force was gone. In the days and weeks that followed, as winter slowly gave way to spring, the empire began to discover what it meant to exist without Charles. Louis the Pious took up the burden of rule, trying to fill shoes that were, quite literally and figuratively, too large for him. He was a good man, a devout Christian, a capable administrator. But he was not his father. He lacked Charles's martial prowess, his ruthless decisiveness, his ability to hold disparate elements together through sheer force of personality. The empire Charles had built would endure after a fashion for another generation, but the unity he had imposed was already beginning to fracture. His grandsons would fight civil wars over the succession, eventually dividing the empire in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, creating the foundations of what would become France, Germany, and Italy. The dream of a unified Christian Europe would fade, replaced by the reality of competing kingdoms and petty principalities. Yet even as the political structure crumbled, much of what Charles had created endured. The cultural and educational institutions, the legal frameworks, the administrative innovations, the very idea of a Christian civilization bound together by common learning and faith, these survived the empire's dissolution. The Carolingian Renaissance had preserved learning for future generations. The alliance between temporal and spiritual authority had set patterns that would dominate medieval Europe. The dream of empire itself, once articulated, could never be entirely forgotten. And in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, in the vault beneath the octagonal dome, the emperor rested. Time would pass, dynasties would rise and fall, borders would shift and shift again, but in that space, Charles remained. Not as he had been in life, not truly, but as memory, as symbol, as the embodiment of an age when one man's will had reshaped the world. There are figures in history whose influence transcends their own era, whose decisions and achievements echo down through centuries, shaping the world in ways they themselves could never have fully imagined. Charles stands among this rare company, a man whose life marked a hinge point in Western civilization, whose empire, though short-lived as political entities are measured, created foundations upon which Europe would build for 1,000 years and more. The political legacy was most immediate and paradoxically most fleeting. Within a generation of Charles's death, his empire had split into 3 kingdoms through the Treaty of Verdun in 843. His grandsons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, divided the territories along lines that roughly foreshadowed modern France, Germany, and Italy. The dream of political unity was dead, replaced by the reality of competing dynasties and endless warfare over contested borders. The Carolingian line itself would peter out over the following century, replaced by new dynasties that traced their legitimacy not to Charles's bloodline, but to their own military power and political acumen. Yet the title Charles had claimed outlived his dynasty. The Holy Roman Empire, that strange medieval construct that was, as Voltaire would later quip, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, traced its origins directly to Charles's coronation in 800. Otto I would revive the imperial dignity in 962, and thereafter German kings would claim the title of Roman Emperor, seeking coronation from the Pope, maintaining the fiction of universal Christian empire for 8 centuries more. The empire finally dissolved only in 1806 under pressure from Napoleon, himself a figure who consciously emulated and claimed descent from Charlemagne's legacy. Even in the 20th century, the memory of Charles's unified Christian Europe continued to resonate. The European Union, whatever its political and economic justifications, draws rhetorical power from the Carolingian precedent. The Charlemagne Prize, awarded annually in Aachen for contributions to European unity, explicitly invokes the emperor as symbol of the continent's shared heritage. Whether this is appropriate or merely convenient myth-making is perhaps less important than the fact that, more than 12 centuries after his death, Charles remains a touchstone for debates about European identity. The cultural legacy proved more durable than the political. The Carolingian Renaissance, that flowering of learning and literacy that Charles had patronized, preserved classical knowledge for future generations. Most Latin texts that survive from antiquity do so because Carolingian scribes copied them. The standardized script they developed, Carolingian minuscule, evolved into the lowercase letters we still use today. Every time we write, we employ a technology refined in Charles's scriptoriums, a direct link across 12 centuries to those monastic copyists laboring by candlelight. The educational system Charles mandated, cathedral schools, monastic schools, the palace school at Aachen, created an infrastructure of learning that endured through the medieval period. These schools evolved into the universities of the 12th and 13th centuries, which in turn became the model for higher education worldwide. The 7 liberal arts, the curriculum structure Charles imposed, remained standard until the modern era. The very idea that education should be systematically provided, that literacy is essential to civilization, that learning should be preserved and transmitted, these notions, which seem obvious to us, were revolutionary in the early medieval world, and Charles was their most powerful patron. The alliance between church and state, that fusion of spiritual and temporal authority that characterized Charles's reign, set patterns that dominated European politics for centuries. Kings claimed to rule by divine right, invoking God's sanction for their authority, much as Charles had done. The Pope's power to crown emperors, established at Christmas 800, created endless conflicts between papal and imperial authority throughout the Middle Ages. The investiture controversies, the struggles between popes and emperors, the eventual schism of the Reformation, all trace roots back to the complicated partnership Charles forged between Carolingian dynasty and papacy. Charles's military legacy was more subtle, but no less significant. He transformed the Frankish kingdom from a fairly typical Germanic tribal confederation into something approaching a professional military state. The system of vassalage and military obligation he refined would evolve into feudalism, that characteristic medieval social structure based on reciprocal bonds of loyalty and service. The heavy cavalry that dominated European warfare for centuries received crucial development under Charles's patronage. The very ideal of the Christian knight, fighting for God and king, loyal unto death, finds early expression in Carolingian military culture. For the peoples he conquered, the legacy was more ambiguous. The Saxons became Christian and were integrated into the European mainstream, eventually forming the core of what would become Germany. But the cost in blood and suffering was immense, the cultural destruction nearly total. Their ancient religion vanished, their tribal structures dissolved, their identity transformed beyond recognition. Was this civilization or genocide? The question cannot be answered simply, and perhaps different answers are appropriate for different moral frameworks. Charles brought the Saxons into European civilization, but he did so through methods that, by modern standards, constitute war crimes. The legal innovations, standardized coinage, uniform weights and measures, the capitularies that codified imperial law, created frameworks that long outlasted the empire itself. Medieval kingdoms built on Carolingian foundations, adapting but not abandoning the administrative structures Charles had developed. The very idea of the state as something distinct from the person of the king, as an institution with its own continuity and requirements, emerged more clearly in the Carolingian period than it had since Rome's fall. But perhaps Charles's deepest legacy is more intangible. He demonstrated that the post-Roman world could be organized, that civilization could be rebuilt, that learning and order were not permanently lost. The centuries before Charles are called the Dark Ages in part because they seemed to offer no hope of recovery, no path back to the achievements of antiquity. Charles proved that new forms of civilization could emerge, that capable rulers could impose order on chaos, that the barbarian kingdoms could evolve into something more than tribal confederations bound by personal loyalty. He became, in medieval imagination, a figure larger than life. The Song of Roland, composed centuries after the events it purported to describe, presented a Charles who was more legend than man, ancient and wise, bearded and majestic, the perfect Christian king. Medieval writers claimed him for their own causes, inventing traditions and prophecies, making him the origin point for their own ambitions. By the High Middle Ages, Charles was Charlemagne, a name that meant greatness itself, a standard against which all other rulers were measured and found wanting. And in a sense, that mythic Charlemagne was not entirely false. Charles had achieved something remarkable. He had taken a fragmented, violent, ignorant world and imposed upon it order, learning, and at least the aspiration to justice. The empire crumbled, the unity dissolved, but the memory remained. The idea that Europe could be one, that Christian civilization could flourish, that learning and law could triumph over chaos, these ideas, given concrete form by Charles's life work, could not be erased by his empire's political collapse. When we speak of the father of Europe, we speak not primarily of political boundaries or dynastic claims, but of cultural foundations. Charles helped create a European identity distinct from both the classical Mediterranean world and the tribal Germanic cultures. He fused Roman Christianity with Germanic military culture, added elements of learning and administrative sophistication, and produced something new, medieval European civilization, which would dominate the continent for centuries and eventually spread across the globe. His legacy is complicated, contradictory, impossible to reduce to simple judgment. He was a conqueror who brought both civilization and suffering, a warrior who patronized learning, an emperor who ruled through personal authority, yet built institutional structures that outlasted him, a Christian king who ordered massacres, a Germanic warlord who preserved Latin culture. He was, in short, deeply and completely human, capable of both great achievement and great cruelty, driven by ambition yet also by genuine vision, pragmatic yet also idealistic. More than 12 centuries after his death, we still argue about Charlemagne, still invoke his name, still measure European unity and identity against the standard he set. The empire is long gone, the dynasty extinct, the man himself dust in a vault at Aachen. But the idea remains, the legacy endures, and the father of Europe still shapes in ways subtle and profound the world we inhabit today. Perhaps that is the truest measure of historical greatness, not the territories conquered or the battles won, but the degree to which a single life continues to matter, continues to influence, continues to inspire debate and reflection across the vast gulf of time.